She smirked as she walked into the courtroom, the kind of smile that said she thought she'd already won. The cameras caught it. The whispers in the gallery turned into quiet disbelief. People had seen arrogance before, but this was different. This was a woman who believed the system couldn't touch her. Miss Carter, the teacher who once stood at the front of a classroom, now stood before a judge, arms crossed, chin raised, almost daring anyone to challenge her. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't even pretending to be sorry. To her, this was all a misunderstanding, one she thought her charm and confidence could fix. The judge's gavel echoed, and everyone turned quiet. But Miss Carter didn't. She laughed softly under her breath, shaking her head like the whole thing was beneath her. The prosecutor laid out the facts, messages, evidence, witnesses, but none of it seemed to break her composure. Every time a new piece of evidence appeared, she'd smirk again, whisper something to her lawyer, and glance toward the cameras as if the audience was on her side. To her, this wasn't justice. It was theater. Her downfall began long before that day, though. It started in the small-town high school, where she was once adored. Her students called her the cool teacher, the one who joked around, who stayed after class to talk about life. But beneath the surface, she had started crossing lines that teachers are never supposed to cross. What began as mentoring slowly turned into manipulation. She blurred boundaries, convinced herself it was harmless, until someone spoke up. When the first accusation surfaced, she denied it with the same confidence she carried into court. She told everyone it was revenge, a lie, a jealous rumor, and people believed her for a while, because she looked the part, professional, well-spoken, and charming. But charm doesn't erase evidence, and her story began to crack under pressure. She thought she could talk her way out, just like she always had. But this time, the truth had a voice of its own, and it was about to speak louder than she ever could. When the trial resumed the next morning, Miss Carter arrived wearing the same calm expression, as if she were walking into a classroom instead of a courtroom. Her hair was perfectly styled, her posture flawless. Reporters lined the hallway, calling out questions, but she didn't respond. She simply smiled, that same cold, rehearsed smile, as if she were still in control. Inside, the air was heavy. The jury members avoided her gaze. The parents of her former students sat stiffly in the back. And yet, she carried herself like the victim of a misunderstanding. As the prosecution began to reveal more, her mask started to slip. They played recordings, showed printed messages, and brought forward students who once saw her as a mentor. Their voices shook as they spoke, describing moments that blurred the line between admiration and fear. Each word cut through the courtroom like a blade. Miss Carter leaned back in her chair, eyes fixed on the judge, lips curled in faint irritation, as if this was all a waste of her time. But behind that calm exterior, cracks were forming. Her hand trembled slightly when she reached for a glass of water. Her lawyer leaned in to whisper something, but she brushed him off. The judge watched her closely. Every smirk, every whisper, every subtle roll of her eyes didn't go unnoticed. When asked if she had anything to say in her defense, she stood with a deliberate pause, looked directly at the judge, and said, "I've given my life to teaching. These lies are destroying everything I've worked for. You're making a mistake." Her voice carried arrogance more than sorrow. And that tone, the one that made her seem untouchable, only sealed how disconnected she'd become from the truth. Outside the courthouse, the public's opinion had shifted. People who once defended her were now silent. The media replayed clips of her smirking in court, her dismissive gestures, her unwillingness to show even a trace of remorse. It was no longer a question of whether she did it. It was a matter of how far she thought she could go before someone stopped her. And yet, despite the evidence stacking against her, Miss Carter still believed she could win. She still believed the system would bend, that her reputation could save her one last time. What she didn't know was that justice had already made up its mind, and the reckoning she thought would never come was now just moments away. The tension inside the courtroom could be felt even in the silence between testimonies. Miss Carter sat with her hands folded neatly, staring straight ahead, pretending she was unaffected. But the whispers behind her told a different story. Every witness who took the stand peeled away another layer of the image she had spent years crafting. The kind, dependable teacher who cared deeply for her students. One by one, that illusion fell apart. A former student described how it started. Small gestures, private compliments, text messages that seemed friendly until they weren't. He hesitated before speaking, his voice cracking as he tried to explain how something that began as trust slowly turned into fear. The courtroom listened in uncomfortable silence. Miss Carter shifted in her seat, her jaw tightening. She didn't look at him once. Instead, she stared down at her notes, flipping pages that didn't need flipping, anything to appear in control. When the prosecutor asked her about the messages later, her tone changed. She laughed quietly, shaking her head, saying they were taken out of context, that the students misunderstood her. But the jury wasn't buying it. Her sarcasm, once her shield, now looked like defiance. The more she tried to downplay it, the colder the room became. Even her attorney avoided her gaze. The judge finally interrupted, his voice calm but firm, reminding her that this was a courtroom, not a classroom debate. "Miss Carter," he said, "I suggest you remember where you are." For the first time, her smirk faltered. The words hung in the air, heavy and unshakable. Cameras captured that fleeting moment, the split second when her confidence cracked. When she realized this wasn't a stage she could control. Outside, the story was spreading faster than she could keep up with. Former colleagues came forward. Parents began speaking to reporters. What was once a story about a beloved teacher now turned into something darker, a story about trust broken and lines crossed in ways no one wanted to imagine. That night, as she left the courthouse, surrounded by flashing cameras and shouted questions, she didn't smile. The mask had slipped. Her lawyer guided her to the car, but her eyes, cold, distant, and suddenly unsure, said it all. For the first time, Miss Carter wasn't mocking anyone. For the first time, she looked like she understood that justice wasn't a game. By the fourth week of the trial, the courtroom felt like a stage where every truth was finally being dragged into the light. Ms. Carter still walked in each morning with her chin lifted, her expression composed, but the weight of what had unfolded was undeniable. The jury had seen enough, her messages, her dismissive laughter, her lack of empathy. The once respected teacher now seemed like a stranger, even to those who once defended her. The prosecution called a psychologist to the stand, someone who had interviewed both Ms. Carter and her former students. The testimony was clinical but devastating. The psychologist spoke about control, how Ms. Carter used attention and praise to manipulate, how she blurred the boundaries between authority and affection to maintain power. Each sentence struck harder than the last. Ms. Carter sat still, pretending not to listen, but her hands gripped the edge of the table so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Then came her turn to testify. She adjusted the microphone and began her defense with a familiar tone, confident, rehearsed, almost teacher-like. "I never meant harm," she said. "I cared for my students. That's what teachers do." But there was no warmth in her voice, only frustration that no one seemed to believe her. The prosecutor asked her direct questions, and each time her answers grew shorter, sharper. When confronted with undeniable proof, screenshots, recorded conversations, she smirked and said, "People will twist anything to fit their story." That line changed everything. The judge looked up, expression unreadable, and the jury members exchanged glances. It wasn't just her actions being judged anymore. It was her attitude, her refusal to acknowledge the pain she'd caused. Her confidence had become arrogance. Her self-assurance had turned into contempt. By the time court adjourned, the atmosphere had shifted completely. The same reporters who once described her as poised and composed now used words like defiant and unrepentant. Her name had become a headline synonymous with betrayal. As she left the building, Someone in the crowd shouted, "Where's your smile now, Miss Carter?" She didn't respond. The smirk that once defined her was gone. What remained was a hollow expression, part anger, part disbelief, the realization that the story she thought she controlled had taken on a life of its own, and it was spiraling beyond her reach. The final days of the trial felt like the calm before a storm, the kind where everyone knows what's coming but no one dares to say it out loud. The courtroom was packed. Even people who had no personal connection to the case showed up just to witness the ending of a story that had gripped the entire town. Miss Carter sat silently beside her lawyer, no longer smirking, no longer whispering. The confidence that once radiated from her had turned into something else, a quiet, brittle tension, like glass on the verge of breaking. The prosecutor delivered a closing argument that left the room in stunned silence. He spoke not only of what Miss Carter had done, but of how she carried herself through it. The laughter, the mockery, the way she turned her trial into a stage. "Remorse," he said, his voice steady, "is not something you perform. It's something you feel. And from this seat, we've seen no sign of it." His words hit her harder than any evidence ever could. She stared down at the table, blinking quickly, but she never looked up. Then her defense attorney stood. He tried to paint a picture of a misunderstood woman, a teacher under pressure whose actions were taken out of context. He spoke of her years of service, her dedication, her passion for teaching. But the words didn't land. The jury wasn't listening to excuses anymore. They'd already seen too much. When the judge finally began speaking, the entire room fell silent. His tone was deliberate, controlled, but there was an unmistakable weight behind every word. He spoke about trust, how educators hold one of the most sacred responsibilities, and how breaking that trust isn't just a legal failure, it's a moral one. Miss Carter kept her head high, trying not to show emotion, but her eyes glistened as the judge continued. As he addressed her directly, he said something no one would forget. "You mocked this court, believing your charm could bend truth itself. But justice doesn't bend. It waits, and it finds you." A hush swept across the room. Miss Carter's face went still. For the first time, she didn't have a reply, no smirk, no glance, no dismissive gesture. Just silence. In that moment, everyone knew the end was near. The teacher who once commanded classrooms and defied authority now sat frozen, waiting for a sentence she had convinced herself would never come. The courtroom felt like it was holding its breath as the judge lifted the papers in front of him. The final decision. Ms. Carter sat motionless, staring straight ahead, her expression unreadable. Outside, the noise of cameras and murmuring reporters could be faintly heard, but inside, the world had narrowed to this single moment. Every choice she had made, every word she had spoken, every smirk and denial, it all led here. When the sentence was read, the sound of it echoed like a door slamming shut. Years, not months. Not probation, years behind bars. For the first time since the trial began, her composure cracked completely. Her lips parted slightly, as if she couldn't quite believe what she'd heard. The courtroom stayed silent, except for a few gasps from the crowd. Her lawyer leaned over to whisper something, but she didn't respond. Her eyes were locked on the judge, disbelief slowly giving way to anger, and then to something even deeper, fear. The judge continued speaking, reminding her of the gravity of her actions, how every decision had consequences. "This isn't a lesson from a classroom," he said firmly. "This is real life, and in real life, accountability is not optional." Those words hit harder than the sentence itself. Ms. Carter lowered her gaze, her shoulders trembling slightly, as reality began to sink in. The arrogance that once defined her was gone. All that remained was silence, the kind that follows when someone finally understands that their power has vanished. As the bailiff approached, she looked toward the back of the courtroom. The faces that once smiled at her were now turned away. No one clapped. No one cried for her. The same community that had once admired her now saw her for who she truly was, not the confident, composed teacher she pretended to be, but a woman who believed she was untouchable until the truth proved otherwise. When she was finally led out, her steps were slow, heavy, and uncertain. The smirk that once mocked the judge had been replaced by an empty stare. The cameras outside captured her one last time, not the proud figure who entered weeks ago, but the broken one who left, realizing that justice, no matter how long it takes, always finds its way. And as the doors closed behind her, the courtroom exhaled, the lesson complete, the arrogance silenced, and the truth finally standing where her confidence once stood.